I hate everything right now. This is a microcharger. These were little toys from when I was growing up. You just put them into this little charger and let them rip, and they'd drive. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's just a car that goes forward, right? Ever since I started getting into electrical engineering, because that's sort of my job, I'm more of an electrician. That part doesn't matter. But I studied a lot of electrical engineering to learn my job. And I heard about capacitors, and I really wanted to figure out a way to supercharge one of these microchargers. What does this mean? I don't really know. I kind of just want to make it either go faster or maybe drive longer. I haven't figured that part out yet. Opening it up, you can see it's actually a pretty simple circuit. It's just a capacitor with a motor soldered in parallel. Those two little nubs in the back of the car, those are literally just the terminals of the capacitor. To start off with my experiments, I just tried pulling the capacitor and the motor out of the car. This way I could test some circuits later in the future and just see if I can get something else to work. If you look really carefully, you can see that this capacitor is rated at 2.7 volts and 1 farad worth of capacitance. What does this mean? Well, that means that you can really only put a maximum of 2.7 volts through the capacitor without making it go kablooey. Now, I ran some tests later and I attached a 9-volt battery to it, but you'll see what happens when we get there. I didn't break it. And then it's rated at 1 farad, which I also later learned is an incredibly high amount of capacitance in comparison to the ones I have. This caused some issues. Notice how all of those say UF. That little UM thing stands for micro. There are 1,000,000 microfarads in 1 farad. So my capacitance was really low. Now I know a lot more now post-recording than I did at the time of filming this, but I decided to give it a shot anyway. I started off with this capacitor. It has a voltage rating of 50 volts, so that would not be an issue. I was just using 2 AAA batteries. And then it had a capacitance rating of 1 microfarad. Yeah, 1,000,000th the capacitance of the ones in the microchargers. So I just took the circuit out of the car and took the motor off just so I could play around a little bit. Next, we get to play with the soldering iron. Okay, so now it's time to solder, and before everybody goes off on me in the comments, yes, I sort of know how to solder, but 1, the cable was not nearly long enough to catch in view of the camera, and so it's kind of a pain in the ass, and 2, this is an $8 soldering iron I got from a local shop. I don't even know what, but yeah, it sucked. So I used this little trick I learned a while ago when you don't want people to watch you do something you're bad at, and that's making sure your camera is out of focus. See, this was very strategically planned by me ahead of time. I proceeded to do something stupid and show you guys what it looked like when I was done. I kind of learned how to use this specific soldering iron later, and that's to crank the heat way the fuck up. I also ended up buying flux a little bit later, which also really helped. But yeah, this is my first attempt.
So it's a few days later. I got some 9-volt batteries. I just want to test to see if I can get it to work. So yeah, I don't know.
So I did a little bit more soldering off camera, and I hooked up some motors that I bought on eBay to some of the bigger capacitors, the higher farad rating, and the other 2 actually had lower voltage ratings, but it didn't matter. I was just using a 9-volt battery. So annoyingly, it didn't work. I would hook it up to the AAA batteries and the motor would spin, but then the moment I took it off, the motor would just stop. The capacitor was not holding any charge. And at this point, I thought it was still because of the voltage issue, not because of the farad issue. So I went to the store, I bought some 9-volt batteries, and I just wanted to test it out to see if it would work. I decided to actually record these tests because, I don't know, I thought it might be kind of interesting. The motors were only rated for 3 volts, and I was pumping 9 volts through them, so we'll see what happens.
The motor might also blow up. This is very hard to get a good shot of. I'm doing my best. So it's technically working?
No, it's not, dumbass. Also, if you look carefully, the motor is actively dying in front of you. It's getting a lot slower, which is not how motors are supposed to work. So, yeah, good job destroying a motor as well. Just for continuity's sake, I also hooked up the capacitor that I pulled from the microcharger with a different motor I attached to it, and tested it on the 2 AAA battery rig I had, which is just a microcharger launcher taken apart, and it still worked.
Can't really hear it, but trust me, it's still spinning. Ow! Fuck, that's hot. That's definitely too much voltage for the motor. Can somebody explain to me how capacitance works? But the resistance is still 0. Would upping the resistance help? I don't understand.
At this point, I was giving up. I could not figure out how to make it work. The answer ended up being relatively simple. I mean, I think, honestly, I have not successfully done anything yet, but according to my ungodly amount of research, I am pretty sure a super cap will work, or super capacitor. But I was just gonna edit this, and you know I was still gonna release it, even if there's no content in here. I mean, I'm desperate, what can I say? But then I did what I do best and spent the next 5 hours studying electrical engineering and capacitors and formulas and stuff like that, and came to some interesting conclusions. That's right, boys. We're breaking out Notepad. So there were a lot of problems with what I have been doing. We're going to start with the first, and probably the most basic. There's an equation to determine how much energy a capacitor will hold. This equation is E equals 1/2 of C times V squared. E is going to be overall energy in joules, 1/2 is 0.5, C is the total capacitance of the whole entire circuit, and V is the voltage you're inputting into that circuit. So I'm going to start out by solving the energy for just the basic microcharger with what already comes in. This is going to be 0.5 because of the half times 1 for 1 farad times approximately 9 because 2 AAA batteries is 3 volts, and then that squared is 9. Now, after plugging that into this equation, we get approximately 4.5 joules of power. Now time to figure out how much joules we were getting from the circuit I was creating. Now, I obviously had multiple little doodahs I made, but I'm just going to stick with the one that was 1000 microfarads and 16 volts, because that's the most basic, and honestly it was the highest joule output we're going to get. Now, plugging everything into this formula again, we get 0.5, because of, you know, the half, times 1000 microfarads, which is the same as 0.001 farads, times, I'm just going to say we used a 9-volt battery, which we did, 81. This calculates to a total of 0.0405 joules. I don't know if you know this, but 0.04 is not the same as 4.5. It's a very, very big difference. It's about 1/100th the power output. Now, for those of you out there who are like, well, why don't you just add more capacitors to the circuit? This way, you know, you can get the capacitance you need, thus upping the joule output. Well, that is technically possible, but you can't just add capacitors to a circuit. You would need to add them in parallel. This is the only way to actually increase the total capacitance of one. So why don't I just add more capacitors in parallel? Well, there are a few issues. In order to find the total capacitance of a circuit, you take all of the farad values and add them together. Now, if I wanted to even reach 1 farad, that would mean I would need 1000 microfarad capacitors. I have 10. Luckily, there still might be something that can save me. There are these things called supercaps, or supercapacitors. They typically have a lower voltage rating, so you can't pump as much electricity through them, but they also have incredibly high farad levels. Now, if you remember from earlier, this is a good thing, because the higher the capacitance, the more energy output we'll have. Sure, you can increase the voltage rating, but just by increasing one of the caps to have, let's say, 1 farad, that's already 1,000 times as much capacitance as the ones I currently have. But there's even more to this. To understand how long a capacitor will take to fully discharge all of its electrons, we have to break out another formula. Now, to be completely honest, I got a little bit confused over this one because one website had something about the ratio of voltage or something. I don't know, but I'm just going to go with what I understood. This formula is going to be T equals RC. T is a singular time constant, R is the total resistance of the circuit, and C is the total capacitance of the circuit. In order to figure out how long a capacitor will take to fully discharge, we need to multiply the T constant by 5. So in the end, that just basically nets us the equation T equals 5RC, T being total time, not time constant. Now, if we remember the little contraption I made, the capacitor only had a rating of 1,000 microfarads. So that's automatically going to drop that time constant down really, really low in comparison to something with a higher capacitance rating. So to kind of summarize this clusterfuck of science, there are a few key features we need to take away. We want the power, the overall joules of our equations, to go up. Now, in order to achieve this, we also need our capacitance to go up. We also want the total amount of time it takes for one of these capacitors to discharge to go up, which once again, we also need the total amount of capacitance to go up. There's kind of one key thing holding us back here, and that's the capacitors we have. Now, there is something else I can technically do in order to get these motors to discharge at a slower rate. Sort of. So we know from the equation T equals R times C that if R were to go up, then our time constant would go up. And if C were to go up, our time constant would also go up. Since we don't have any better capacitors at this moment, I could technically add resistance to the circuit to then increase the total amount of time it'll take for the capacitor to discharge. This means all I need to do is just add a resistor, and I actually do have resistors, but there is yet another issue with this. Let's math out what type of resistor we would need in order to get one of our motors to discharge in approximately 15 seconds. So in order to get the total time, we're going to need to take 5 for the 5 time constants and multiply that by 1,000 microfarads, because that is the rating of our capacitor, and then try and figure out what we need to put in for R in order to get around 15 for T. Also, yes, I did write 10 seconds, but I realized that 15 would be an easier number to get, so I just decided to change it to 15 later. Now, using my absolutely godlike Algebra 1 math skills, I was able to determine that this would mean we would need a 3 kilo ohm resistor. Yes, 3 kilo ohm. You heard me right. And yes, that is a lot of ohms. And yet we run into another issue. Our current circuit output is only about 0.04 joules, and with a resistor this big, that means that we're probably not even going to get enough power to go into the motor to spin anything. That resistor is going to absorb the majority of that power, and so nothing will happen. So that's kind of cool. I did actually test this just to see if I could get it to work, but it didn't. I was right. When I hooked it up to the 9-volt battery, literally nothing happened. The motor didn't even spin when I was touching the terminals. So overall, what I've learned today is I need to buy some supercaps. So I know this is like a super anticlimactic ending to a video, but I kind of knew I'd be breaking it up into 3 parts. This one would of course be the theory of operation, trying to figure out just how to get it to work. The second one is going to be me actually going and buying the right materials, because I knew this would fail. From the get-go, I had this feeling in the back of my head that something would go wrong. I'd have to do a shit ton of research and then figure it out. And then the third video will be me actually making something with it. I'll probably have to reprint new like bases for the cars and stuff like that. But yeah, this is just part 1 in this series. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, because I certainly did. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye now.